Welcome back, Doubtcasters, or Doubts Aloud casters, as I'd like to say. Well, we're on episode 7, and we've got a really interesting episode. We are going to round up our Summer of Atonement series, and we are going to be atoning for our sins in this one. We've also got Ed's usual climate endnote. We've got a really fascinating Is That in the Bible? That's going to relate to a bonus episode of a guest speaker that's going to come out in the middle of August. So watch out for making a mention of that a bit later on. But first, as usual, Ed, what kind of news have you got for us?
We've been enjoying these wonderful big conversations that Justin Brierley on the Unbelievable show has been conducting for us, and I think it's high time we kind of gave a little bit of feedback from our side on them all.
Okay, well, Francis, what have you got to say for these?
I've enjoyed them. I think if we're the first one was the Jordan Peterson and Susan Blackmore interview. I am not a fan of Peterson at all. I think he is an academic non-entity who managed to project himself into great prominence by claiming some bogus martyrdom by misrepresenting a change in the Canadian law, which he claimed was going to criminalise him for if he didn't refer to non-binary or transgender people by their preferred pronouns. But anyway, that's kind of his background, and I think he's played on that, and it's played well to a certain audience, and I'm afraid that does include very often a more conservative Christian audience who like that sort of thing. What do you think? What
is amazing, Francis, is there's some interesting bedfellows. I was only listening to Jordan Peterson last night on the Bill Maher show. American sort of comedian sort of talk show, very, very popular in a sort of anti-Republican kind of stance, and they were absolutely hitting it off. Bill Maher was recommending his book 12 whatever it is. What was it called?
12 Rules for Life, Living, or something like that. Yeah.
That's right, and I couldn't believe it, because I'm thinking, here we go. This is where you get the attacks on conservative Christianity coming full swing from Bill Maher for 20, 30 years now. And here we have a sort of a celebration of Jordan Peterson there, and yet he is being taken up on board. Maybe, Ed, you can say more about that, by the conservative church.
Well, I think he's a bit of a chameleon in a way. Justin Brierley did an article about him in the Premier Christianity magazine, which I read this morning, and Justin really he seems to be frustrated about Peterson in the same way that we are, and that he doesn't ever seem to be able to be pinned down. He kind of says what seemed to sort of suit him at the time, and keeps things very vague and enigmatic.
In the interview with Blakemore, some of the things he said I just found quite bizarre, such as that if you get up in the morning and you go for a pee and then you have something to eat, that in some way is evidence that really whatever you claim, you believe in God. And I couldn't understand why he said that. I couldn't understand why Susan Blackmore didn't challenge him more on it. I mean, my dogs get up in the morning, they go for a pee and they have something to eat. Does that mean they really believe in God? There just seemed to be no connection between yes, it was. I found that quite extraordinary. I mean, what did you make of that?
He comes out with some fascinating statements. That I was listening to one show yesterday, some sort of debate, and I thought it was a YouTube chip called Peterson's Comebacks, Good Comebacks, and they were great comebacks from this debate. And in that session, I thought he was, from just coming into it, not necessarily seeing the whole context, but just coming into it and listening, I thought, this guy's amazing. I thought he was great. But I talked to Ed just briefly about something like that, and he said that some things you think he is great in, and other things he's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
When he's on topic in his area of expertise in philosophy, I thought he was great. I was very impressed with him on an earlier Unbelievable show where they had a clip of a three-way discussion somewhere in Canada. William Lane Craig was one of the other contributors, and an atheist who seemed a bit kind of woolly on the topic, which was on getting meaning from life. And Peterson was I thought was pretty good all through. There's only occasionally something great.
I liked the part of that show. I did like Peterson where he exposed the moral bankruptcy of William Lane Craig's stance on what gives life meaning. And I thought he was very good in that bit. But it doesn't quite seem to add up with what he's saying in later programmes. Because what he was saying in response to William Lane Craig was your claim, that is your WLC's claim, that a suffering child, the suffering of a child, only has meaning if in 10 million years' time that child still exists in some form. So in other words, if in 10 million years' time the whole universe will have died from heat death and none of us will be left, then the suffering of that child is meaningless. And he was quite... he was pretty full on his attack, and he said that sort of talk comes from the devil. I mean, it was quite a strong response to it, and I did like that. But now he's or in his conversation with Blakemore, he seemed to be saying the same thing, that you can't just look at a suffering child in front of you and think, this is something I need to do in the moment now. It doesn't matter about 10 million years' time. It doesn't matter about some transcendental reality. It just has, what I can do just has meaning in this moment. He seems to have done a 180-degree turn on that and be saying that it needs to be more than that.
I think what he's saying... what I think he's saying is that you have to have some kind of higher principle that you're running things by, some drive, so it matters to you to look after the suffering child or whatever. But then he winds people like us up by calling that God and saying, well, if you believe in God if you act morally.
That's right. He says you have a system of values, and your whatever is at the top of that system of values or priorities is God. Well, okay, if you define God that way, then we are all... None of us are atheists. Yes. I'm not an atheist if you define God like that. I've got things at the top of my list of
But
priorities. It
almost seems designed to wind us up.
And also, he winds Justin Brearley up, I think, from the article from us looked at, that I think I'm sure it's mentioned there and by others, that he will quote evolutionary psychology big time. So referencing the millions of years of the planet and everything else. And then he will quote Genesis 1 as very important for the dignity of man, made in some sort of image of God, and yet not necessarily defining what God he believes in. And so it gives a mixed, are you talking literal Genesis? Are you taking it as just a good model and metaphor for another concept, And so this is why and for those of you listening and you wonder what the heck we're talking about, is Jordan Peterson, who has made headlines around the world on talk shows and just look it up on YouTube, put Jordan Peterson. He's sort of made the big time on the rounds. Very popular with males, evidently. Like an 80%
young
popularity
men.
with males, which is really interesting. Young males, yeah. Anyway, so look that up and you will see what the phenomena of Jordan Peterson is and make up your own mind.
Yeah. And there's been two other absolutely wonderful discussions. One with Steven Pinker, who I thought came over brilliantly, and then a gentle, fun, pleasant chat between is it John Coles, Richard Coles,
Richard Coles, and Darren Brown. Richard Coles, Cole or Coles and Darren Brown.
So just to clarify, Ed, you mean on the unbelievable series that Justin's now doing?
Yeah, The Big Conversation.
Which is called, what's the
Big
title?
The Big Conversation.
The Bigger Conversation.
And then it's a sort of YouTube channel
Darren
as well,
Brown.
I think, now, and he's trying to give it a wider life.
Yeah. I listened to the one thoroughly on Darren Brown and Richard Cole, which was really the most amiable conversation I think I've heard in a long time, that you really thought that it was just a slight difference in wording about life, rather than any massive... It's incredible,
Yeah, they
really,
agreed pretty well all the way
to
through.
listen to that show. They did, yeah. It's just slightly different terminology in the end. You could look semantics, but it just seems so polite and cordial. I couldn't really put them on my YouTube series, having to go each. Christian diversity, hardly. It's like, Anyway, so let's move on. Ed, what have we got next?
We're going to finish off our Summer of Atonement. Great. Now, in the first two episodes on our Summer of Atonement, we first looked briefly at the kind of mess that is the Christian views on penal substitutionary atonement that Andrew explained and gave his Christian diversity on, and how it was quite a mess of opinions. And also Francis looked on just the specific legal side of it, with is it possible under Anglo-US law to transfer guilt from one person to another. Then last time we took a bit of a step back and looked at it more historically, going right back to animal sacrifice in the ancient Near East and how that might have fed into ideas of taking away sin by killing animals, and then that moved on to prophecies in particularly the Isaiah 53 passage of the suffering servant, and how that might have fed into people's understanding of what it meant when Jesus, their Messiah, got killed on a cross. But again, Francis sort of picked up on how the other Old Testament passages flatly contradicted the way that you can transfer guilt onto a suffering servant figure or anyone else. So that was sort of roughly where we got to. So what we're going to do now?
Well, Andrew is now going to talk us through some of the historical Christian approaches and the varying theories about how the atonement works.
It's very interesting. As you've seen in Christianity, there is a myriad of different views, it seems, on so many subjects, none less than this one. I mean, it would be very true to say that really this is such a diverse subject that, obviously it's called atonement theory, and there's a lot of theories out there. So let me just put some titles out on atonement theories from the inception of the primitive church, as people like to talk. We've got what's called, these are terms that people listening may have heard or not heard. We've got the moral influence theory, quite an early one. We've got something called the ransom-theory. We've got christus-victor, the satisfaction theory, which we sort of covered, the penal-substitutionary theory, which we've kind of covered, the governmental theory, the scapegoat theory, and there's probably a few other sort of even lesser known ones. So just before I go on anything, what do you two make of such titles?
It's a good illustration of the extent of the disagreement.
Yes, and the flailing about trying to make sense of something that clearly doesn't.
That could be, the conclusion we get to before we've even, right off the bat, really. It's like no one, wouldn't the obvious thing be that the fact that there's so many theories going around is you don't really know what happened. It's evolving and trying to understand it. So just to sort of unpack this a little bit more, let's just talk about there's a standard portrayal that's going around that has a lot of merit to it, but it's being challenged. But nevertheless, the standard portrayal is this: it's that the ransom theory, which I'll unpack just briefly later, and the christus-victor theory were the prominent views of the early church, almost from the very beginning to at least the 11th century. It's then spoken of the satisfaction theory, sort of came about sort of right there at that time, which really sort of tried to do away with these earlier views. This sort of lasted into the Reformation period, in which it was built upon, and then the penal substitution satisfaction kind of theory developed more, and that's the way it's been portrayed. Now, I think from my research and understanding that it's probably more complicated than that. It's nice. I mean, you do hear people that are against penal substitution say this all the time. Steve Chalk, others say the same thing. A lot of it comes from a book in the 1930s by a chap called Gustav Aloud said, called Christus-victor, and paints this sort of traditional view.
When was the first time that theologians were sort of discussing it with a view that we've got a problem here, rather than just assuming everybody understood that their view was the universal view?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question. I mean, it depends. Like the penal-substitution view was sort of well accepted in certain quarters, like in the Reformation period, but it was then later sensitivities, it seems, come in and see this doesn't work or it's unjust. A bit like Anselm, who's the name behind the satisfaction theory in the 11th century, had massive problems with how the previous theories had developed and almost looked like a joke, because that's just unpacking how I can talk about the ransom theory now. A very, very early view was that, built upon this sort of the phrase we've talked about in the previous episode, ransom, Christ died as a ransom for many, was built upon massively in the sense that Satan was paid something. Okay, now, if anyone wants a good clarification of what the ransom theory of the atonement is, one only needs to go to The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe to see C.S. Lewis' portrayal of Aslan being, I forget the name of the main character now, who was like...
Edmund. It was either Edward or Edmund. It's Edmund, yeah.
Thank you very much. Edmund, indeed. Well, Edmund was under that sort of law, the system that was just there in Narnia. But Aslan then took his place, and tricked, kind of. In other words, that the witch and her minions, or whatever you want to call it, were then in glee, thinking, great, we've now got the main guy, and we'll kill him, and then we'll probably kill everyone else. You can see where the story's going. This is the ransom thing: is that there's some kind of law that enacts that the Aslan and the Queen had to sort of subject itself to, and you can see how that wasn't going to sit well later in church history, because it's beyond God, if you like, the sort of laws that are set up. And then there was sort of a trick. It's like a trick to the devil going on. And so Anselm thought that these views were getting a bit silly. And one of the things, Ed, you'll find quite interesting is that these early views of the atonement are saturated in the idea of sort of what we would commonly call today spiritual warfare. You've got the devil. You've got the darkness powers being very much interactive with God's thwarting or trying to, or at war with God, and then God was sort of settling it, defeating the enemies, defeating the powers of darkness. It's almost like mankind had come under, from Adam and Eve, some kind of law that Satan had control of, and to get it back, he sort of gave his life to defeat these enemies. You can see how that in later life seemed to cause a problem, because people thinking, hang around, we're not in a dualistic universe here. God is God, he's in control. And spiritual warfare took a back seat. You can see how these other views came.
So how is that dying for sins rather than dying for kind of recapturing somebody? It doesn't seem a particularly strong connection to dying for sins, like the Old Testament sacrifice of animals.
Yeah, it was. It's funny enough, actually. I read that in the Gustave Holland book. It was like he was trying to do it with called Christus-victor. He was trying to sort of see how the early church was so separate from the Old Testament sacrifice ideas that it sort of launched into this spiritual warfare, and the Eastern Orthodox, of course, completely built up to, even to this day, what's called a Christus-victor view. It has its affinities with ransom theories. It's all to do with the defeat of the enemy. It has a less focus on sins, actually. The Eastern Orthodox Christus-victor view has a much stronger focus on the life of Jesus. Okay, so his entire incarnation, the life, is just as important as the death, which is just as important as the resurrection. You'll notice that in penal substitution, there's almost no need for resurrection. What's going on there? It's all to do with the punishment in your place. The resurrection is sort of like an add-on, or sort of a way, just a different part of the story. Yeah. The life of Jesus plays very little consequence. It's Christ and him crucified. That's how penal substitution.
And that seems to be Paul's big thing. Paul doesn't seem that interested in the life of Jesus. What's interesting about Jesus is that Christ died for sins. And that's the whole thing of the gospel that he gives us in 1 Corinthians 15.
this is where Bart Ehrman would be very much a supporter that the Bible does teach penal substitution in that sense. The Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't see it like that. They see the life of Christ as extremely important, and they see that the atonement is essentially dealing with undoing Adam and Eve's, bringing us all into death. So the key element for the atonement in Eastern Orthodox, or one of the main key elements, is undoing the death. It's restorative. So it's not talking about retributive punishment on each individual. It's talking about we need to restore. Christ has come to restore what Adam put us into. So again, you've got major problems if you don't believe in historical Adam. The whole theology could crumble. But it's undoing the death that he brought the human race, and he's conquered death. His resurrection then is such a strong focus in Eastern Orthodoxy that it doesn't quite be seen like that in evangelical Christianity. So if you're an Eastern Orthodox, you when you look at penal substitution, you're scratching your head. It's really interesting.
In terms of the how the ransom theory works, is the idea that by being sinful, people kind of sign up with the devil, and there's some kind of overarching justice that if you signed up for the devil, you have to stay with the devil unless somebody can buy you out?
That's very much like it was. So the early ransom theory, which was sort of seen as a joke by Anselm, is exactly that. It's like there's a sort of a law. This is where the Narnia one really plays into exactly getting that understanding. The inherent law of the land, which you just assume, means that when Adam sinned, everybody is born in death, so they die. Their sin is with it, or they die because they sin, or however that works. And the ransom theory is taking you back from the rightful ownership that the Satan has. Okay? And in that sort of rather crude idea, you could just see how, hang around, why does anyone have to pay the devil anything?
Yeah.
Isn't God God?
Yes.
You know, I mean, so that was soon seen as ridiculed. But you see, the Eastern Orthodox, when they move to the Christus-victor, they don't see ransom isn't necessarily interpreted as to the devil. We tend to think of ransom as paying off your kidnappers or something, you know. But it's more seen as another way, and so sometimes they see it as God paying himself in a way, sort of upholding a law. And so there's more nuanced views. And today, many progressive liberal Christians hold Christus-victor. Greg Boyd, strong supporter of Christus-victor view.
Can you tell us a bit more about what Christus-victor is, what that theory is?
Well, the views that are argued, that the predominant views of the early church are sort of seen as the terms the dramatic theory, the ransom theory, and Christus-victor. They do have an affinity with one another, and so these views aren't necessarily completely different. But the Christus-victor is more to do with less talk of ransom and more defeat of the enemy. So it's definitely a spiritual warfare view. It's like there's powers of darkness. There's a sort of a reign. It's not just God. You've got Satan, the demons. You've got the demons in control of the earth. You've got Adam putting you into this situation. You're in a helpless situation of death and corruption. And the gospel is all about the redemption of that. And so the Christus-victor view is more on reconciliation and restoration language than it is on punishment for sin. Sin's involved, and it's sort of incorporated, but it's not the biggest thing. Ironically, it's sort of death is the biggest thing. It's the last Adam. We all die in Christ. All shall be made alive. However, whatever you want to make of that, it's not in Adam. Sort of all are. It does say all sinned, but it's not like the focus is on all of sin, so Christ has died. In that, so much in the Eastern Orthodox Christus-victor view, it's like Christ has brought life and immortality to those that believe, and it's undoing the death that came in the garden. These are the strong emphasis of Christus-victor. Yeah. So it's like almost corporate.
So let me see if I've got this right. By dying and then rising again, Christ showed that he had victory and mastership over death. Is that how it works?
Absolutely. That's exactly the language that they would use. That Christ, in a sense, is the first fruits. He's conquered death, gone to the other side, come back, and that's what's going to happen to all those that believe.
Okay.
They will then come to the state of the Garden of Eden, or even beyond that. Irenaeus was very strong on this kind of idea. Or, the Church Fathers are actually used to support all the views.
So is there another view that we've got our penal substitution, and we've got this whole kind of basket of similar views around ransom and penal and christus-victor? Is there another whole seam, or is that?
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. There's sort of. I mean, I would say that you could probably break the atonement down into 3 rough ideas, even though there's probably about 12 concepts. But when I first left my church, as in not like leaving the faith, but leaving my church to come to London, I joined a missionary group called YWAM, Youth with a Mission. And I was completely taken aback by the different view of atonement there than I was naturally brought up in evangelical penal substitution kind of teaching, and was completely shocked, along with lots of other views as well. But this view was called the moral government theory of atonement. And this view is different from the satisfying God's honour, or you're punished, or God is punished in your place, Jesus is punished in your place. This was very similar to penal substitution, but it removes any link to Christ taking your punishment and payment in a transaction kind of way for you, because YWAM is very Arminian. In other words, the logic of penal substitution for that group of people was that if Christ died for you and paid and was punished in your place, then you would be saved. And it either means everyone is saved, or it means that all Christians can be saved but can't lose their salvation. And Arminian theology thinks you can lose your salvation. And so if that's the case, then Christ couldn't have died. It would be unjust to be punished. Christ died for you. He was punished for you. You then leave the faith, and then you punished for your sins. This would be unjust in the moral government view. So they have a whole view that separates. It's like penal substitution, but it means Jesus happened to be punished over here as maybe an example to show God's displeasure with sin, but it was valuable enough to make us turn and repent and not be punished for our sins, but there wasn't an equation like a transaction. So this was quite a shock to me, because it's like, it all looks like the same view of atonement, but actually it doesn't apply itself in the same way. It means you can be saved and not be saved depending on where you stand in your belief at the time. And Christ's atonement works for you, but you can also opt out of it. And it seemed to make sense in that sense.
Yes,
so that's
it sounds to me more like an adjustment on the penal substitution rather than a whole new basket of ideas.
Yes, well, that's the same you'll find with a lot of them. The dramatic view merged into christus-victor, bit of ransom theory in there, but the ransom wasn't to the devil. Same with the satisfaction view of Anselm, isn't penal substitution today, because Anselm probably would have absolutely been shocked if you said Jesus took the punishment in your place. He just said that he sacrificed himself, which sort of satisfied the honour that God had lost. Or if you didn't believe in Jesus, you would be punished. So there was a big difference, but you can see that they're so close. This is why a lot of people with all the views tend to mash them all up together today, and also argue that the Church Fathers taught them all.
Yeah.
Everyone argues for the Church Fathers for their view. I mean, you can see it when you just read stuff. So the whole thing is actually a conglomeration of views, and the best way out of it today for evangelicals is actually to try and take them all on board. You'll see N.T. Wright do this. And tends to try and find harmony with what you can, rather than people that say we're getting rid of penal substitution, like my senior lecturer did at Bible College. He wanted to get rid of penal substitution completely.
So it's a bit like theodicies, where people say it's a bit of this and a bit of that, and there's sort of a bit of truth in the veil of not the veil, was it the of suffering to make us better people. Hick, I think, is the one for that, and then a bit of skeptical theism thrown in, and a bit of the fall is just cause of suffering, and you kind of throw it all in the mix and say, well, between them, I'm sure something's fine. And this seems to be the same sort of approach.
Yes, and not only that church history. Yeah, church history changes depending on the era it's in. It's argued that Anselm was in a feudalistic kind of period of honour and disgrace amongst the higher kings to the lower peasants, and was interpreting God's relationship to people like that. Christus-victor was right in the throe of spiritual battles going on, with the devil, and angels and demons left, right and centre in this hierarchy in the heavens. Penal substitution today is on a down because of the concept, our own concepts of justice and punishment doesn't seem to wash with it. It seems unjust and unfair. So it seems like all the theories are affected by the current state of what things are. Now, from a humanistic point of view, it makes perfect sense. Of course it does. It makes perfect sense. That's why the genocides have come up with a problem today, because it just doesn't wash with the way we are. But may have suited an older culture quite fine, So atonement is affected by culture and beliefs at the time. I've seen it. I can see it now in people talking. The scapegoat theory is a modern theory, a non-violent view. So,
great. Yeah.
So I think really I've covered briefly.
So let's move on. And Frances, with her background in philosophy, has made a bit of a list of what she would see as the philosophical problems with atonement doctrine generally. So we'll have a quick look at that.
Okay. Chiefly, I think the problems are those that have been referred to already. In terms of penal substitutionary atonement, there's a big problem there with justice, because it doesn't accord with our concept of justice, that somebody could be punished for somebody else's wrong and thereby justice be done. It's very crucial to our concept of punishment that it is retributive. And retributive punishment means punishing the guilty party, not punishing somebody innocent. If you punish the wrong person, then the retribution element of justice has failed. It's hard to think of any circumstances in which we would be happy that an innocent person could take the penalty for a guilty person. And it's hard to see why God is enabled to forgive through this, rather than having a further source of grievance against mankind, that a further injustice has been done. The two things don't quite seem to work. There are also some issues with how it works in terms of the three persons of the Trinity. The way it's talked about is always that the Son is sacrificed to satisfy God the Father's need for justice, or God the Father's honour in two of those models. But if all three members of the Trinity are equally holy, equally good, all three must be equally offended by sin, and therefore you wonder, who is Jesus not requiring some recompense from mankind for their sinfulness? And if he is, can he reconcile himself by killing himself? I mean, how does that work? There always seems to be an assumption that it's only God the Father who requires the recompense, and it can be met by God the Father sacrificing his own Son. And the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, sort of seems to drift off and not be involved in this at all. And it's quite hard to see how that can make sense. I don't know. What do you think about that? Any thoughts on that?
I'd say it really applies to all of them, but particularly that last point, that if it's God that has to be satisfied, then as you say, why just the Father? And also, why can't he just forgive if he's so loving and everything? Why is he suddenly so mean that he needs all this death and everything to be satisfied? But on the other hand, you could say, well, there's some greater rule over the whole lot of them, and that's it's like a Euphrano dilemma again, that there's some higher power over God that he has to comply with to get his way in forgiving us.
That's right. Yes.
That's what I brought up about the Christus-victor view. You know, the idea that there's this, or that in Narnia stories, there's the law that they're both supplying to. Oh, there's a greater law, and then Aslan knows a deeper one. What are these laws?
Yes, that's right. Going back to C.S. Lewis and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and the lion dying, there's this line, it's a deeper magic, which to me is a sort of get out. It's not saying what the deeper magic is, it's just referring to it, and we've got to somehow accept it. Which I remember reading it as a Christian, finding that really unsatisfactory. And
the implication is that God is bound by a supervening rule of justice, and that God, in those circumstances, it's difficult to see how God can be, as Christians claim, the source of justice.
So it's looking like, from both of you, that all these views can be summed up as the unsatisfactory view.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes.
Unsatisfactory view number 1, unsatisfactory view number 2.
Unsatisfactory view number 2. Yeah, excellent.
And
stuff.
by putting together 10 unsatisfactory views, you do not make one satisfactory view.
Great. Well, let's try and sort of pull the threads together. From my point of view, I'm seeing this in the overall stream of looking at the 50 arguments for God from Christians and 50 arguments against that we are kind of working through over years probably. And this to me is strong evidence against the truth of Christianity, because it's the kind of thing that we should expect to understand well. It's the core idea of Christianity that we've been rescued by God, or our sins are forgiven. We have this atonement, and that gets us back right with God. And yet, it's such a mess. There's all these different ideas. They seem to conflict with each other. People seem to be almost kind of making it up as they go along. No one seems to agree. The idea that's now become, certainly in evangelical circles, the most prominent, seems riddled with problems that others do pick up on philosophically and theologically. And so this is just the kind of mess you'd expect if Christianity is just people doing their best with what they've got, and not at all the kind of thing you'd expect if there's a God who's directing it all and giving us a revelation and understanding of his ways. You could say that you could sort of play the mystery card, but it seems a strange place where God would want to leave us mystery, understanding how it is that he's rescued us and got us right with him. So it fits perfectly with naturalism and really poorly with the truth of Christianity. And the other way I'd like to sort of sum this up is that when it all comes down to it, it seems to be more like kind of lived art, or a great demonstration or a great gesture of how Jesus has done this thing for us. But there never seems to be any substance that you can understand to what Jesus is actually doing. It just seems to be more kind of show and not actual reality of transaction. And as a way of kind of illustrating this, there's a sketch from the early 1960s from Beyond the Fringe with Jonathan Miller and people that I'd love us to play now, that just sums up what seems to be behind it all.
Perkins, sorry to drag you away from the fun, old boy.
That's all right, sir.
War's not going very well, you know.
Oh, my God.
They're two down, the ball's in the enemy court.
Sir?
War's a psychological thing, Perkins, rather like a game of football.
Yes, sir.
You know how in a game of football, 10 men often play better than 11?
Yes, sir.
Perkins, we're asking you to be that one man.
Sir.
Perkins,
Sir.
I want you to lay down your life.
Yes, sir.
We need a futile gesture at this stage. It'll raise the whole tone of the war. Get up in a crate, Perkins.
Sir.
Hop over to Bremen.
Yes, sir.
Take a shufti.
Sir.
Don't come back.
Right, right.
Goodbye, Perkins. God, I wish I was going too.
Goodbye, sir. Or is it au revoir?
No, Perkins.
Well, that really does sum up how you've summed it up, So I think, Ed, that was a pretty good video clip to end this atonement section on.
Great, let's move on to, is that in the Bible?
That's really in the Bible.
Yep, it's that time again. Is that in the Bible? And for me, this verse was not too many years ago where it was a book I was reading by John Loftus, The Christian Delusion. It was pointed out, or was it another one of his books, but it pointed out that in this verse in Matthew that, and I've never really seen it, and I'm sure you two have been absolutely surprised at something in the Bible that you've read and then not seen something and then seen it. But this is an incredible verse in reality when you think about it as it pertains to the resurrection. It's Matthew 28, verses 16 to 18.
But the 11 disciples went into Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had appointed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted.
Wow, that was an absolute eye-opener to me. And in terms of sort of the resurrection, I was thinking, hey, this is interesting. You mean they saw Jesus, some worshipped, some doubted. It's like, what are you worshipping? I'm not sure if this is Jesus. Is this crazy? What's going on? That, to me, that's how it reads. You two?
That is how it reads. And I wonder we're not given any indication of what the proportions were, are we? Was it 50-50? Was it like 2 worshipping and the rest doubting?
It fits in a bit of a theme. There's doubting Thomas in John as well. And in Acts, the beginning of Acts, it says how Jesus sort of gave them convincing proofs again and again, which sort of gives you a little hint, maybe, that, he just protested too much. That Luke is sort of covering for the fact that there is this theme of people doubting resurrection appearances. You would have thought if Jesus appeared once in a convincing way, why would you need him to be continually giving all these convincing proofs? So this is something I've heard, that it's not just an isolated verse. There is a bit of a theme around the resurrection appearances, that a tradition of there being people doubting has survived into the documents we've got.
And isn't there? It's one of the stories. You guys are better on the knowing all the chronology of how things happened in the Bible. But isn't there a story about 2 people having met him on the road to somewhere, and they're walking along the road to, yes, that's it, and they don't recognise him until apparently they have dinner. That's an awfully long time to be with someone and not recognise them.
Not only that, when he breaks the bread, which is even more weird, as far as I remember. There is, Bart Ehrman calls this the doubting tradition, as Ed was saying. There is this whole theme, and it's a fascinating leftover from how the Gospels came together. John, in the end of John, they saw this man on the beach, and they didn't seem to know it was Jesus, then they did, and it's like, what's going on here? It's not as clear as... it raises a massively interesting question. And this brings me nicely to the fact that we're going to have a bonus episode in the middle of August by a guest speaker who's going to talk on the resurrection and his reasons for doubting the resurrection, having it. And this theme of the doubting tradition will be very much part of his talk. And so do look forward to that coming in the middle of August, and it will just be a bonus special on the resurrection, an interview with all 3 of us, and you'll find out more about that person and his story then.
Well, now, have you got something for us on the climate end note, Ed?
In this one, I'd like to talk about the problem we have of keeping the carbon, like the fossil fuels that are going to produce carbon dioxide, in the ground. It's like almost like money growing on trees. That all the infrastructure's there to let the open the taps and the oil flows, but we've got to stop that happening. And it's really quite difficult to do that. And I'd like to tell a story from my family to illustrate how these things work or can work. And that is right back starting the Second World War. My dad was on trawlers dropping depth charges on submarines and dreaming of what he would be doing after the war. And he decided to plant an orchard with my mum as they met a few years after the war. And in the 50s, their dream came true, and they planted this orchard, which is where I grew up. And after a while, all the infrastructure was in place, like the oil pipelines. And basically, money was sort of growing on trees. There's a lot of work with the picking, the pruning, and all the rest of it. But it was easy to make money harvesting the apples and selling them. And then suddenly, actually, we joined the EU. I don't want to make this Brexit-like. And that did change the economics completely, and the farm started losing money. And I remember the first year of wandering through the orchards during the winter and seeing all these apples that were still on the trees, sort of frozen solid onto the bare branches. And it was like everything had changed. And so that is the way that things could work, just tweaking the economics, and suddenly it's just cheaper to use renewables, and the carbon or the fossil fuels stay in the ground. And to me, that is the only thing that's going to work. Some heavy regulation to stop people just opening the pipes and selling the stuff isn't going to work. The only thing that will work is to change the economics. And that's what the organisation I'm keen on is advocating, that you change the economics through taxation.
Okay, well, thank you, Ed, for that climate end note. And I have to say, my head hurts, not from that, but from all of the atonement stuff. We have done 3 separate sessions of the Summer of Atonement. We've now going to lay that down for a while. I'm sure it'll come back up. But it's been very, very interesting to see and understand some more about the whole idea of Christian atonement. We look forward to anybody who's going to keep following us on for the next episode that we do. Just to remind you, there's going to be a bonus episode in the middle of August on the resurrection with a guest person being interviewed by all 3 of us. And Ed, would you like to say a bit about the Facebook?
Yes, we'd love to hear from you on the Doubts Aloud Facebook page, and also you can email doubtsaloud@gmail.com.
Okay, look forward to any discussions or emails sent to that, or looking at the Facebook, any discussions that start up over this subject, or any of the others that we have done. Anyway, until the bonus episode, I have been Andrew, your host.
I've been Francis.
And I'm Ed.